when you trade fast capital, VC capital and things like that, for power or control, you better be doing it for something that's short-term and trendy and fast, because you can't invest in the long run and have that power. When you look at something like Steve Jobs, which I thought was a great mention by Gisu. Oh, I thought I would get it right and I got it wrong.
That's okay, you'll get it later.
I need to write that out phonetically here. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So the thing is, a big crowd of people was not going to invent the iPhone. Okay? Let's just be clear about that. Crowds are fundamentally and almost profoundly conservative. Okay? They will wear the cow paths into pathways that will go around the mountain and things like that. But an innovator will decide to drill a hole through the middle of the mountain and do something different. And I think we just have to be very aware of that it is, in many cases, people that have a plan. And you know, there's an interesting way to think about this. Think about an iceberg. When the iPhone came out, you saw the tip of the iceberg. It was like this thing. It was like right there above the water. And everyone else started trying to replicate the thing above the water. But with a good architecture, and I really mean that in its deepest sense, I think Steve was an architect. And I think he had a plan that involved kind of really understanding that framework and a lot of experimentation and failure. It didn't matter if other people came out with fast follows, because he had that giant thing under the water that gave him instant future-proofing, that gave him the ability to come out with one more innovation after one more innovation. And I think we have to be just aware that investing in that kind of thinking is a really important thing. Everything is not going to get solved. You know, there's a discussion about the cathedral and the bazaar, and people talk about this in open source. You know, isn't it great, the bazaar, all bugs are shallow when you have a whole bunch of people looking at it. The question is, 500 years later, do you want your kids just playing in a bazaar that never changes every day? Or do you actually want to build something that, like a cathedral, that like makes generations actually look up, that actually does something different? And I think we just have to be not naive about this. The last point I'd make, and I think that's just the capital part, the generativity part. Architecture confers generativity. It confers the ability to generate ideas easily. So I'll give you a really simple example. A generative architecture. Let's say along the top, I want to make a new product, and it's going to be a confection. And so along the top, I build a grid, and along the top, I put the outside of the confection. Maybe it could be chocolate covered, or it could be peanut butter, or it could be bacon, or it could be jalapeno. It could be a whole bunch of things along the outside. Along the side of that grid, I put the inside. Maybe chocolate, peanut butter, jalapeno, bacon, etc. Now, chocolate, not very generative. Peanut butter, not very generative. Peanut butter chocolate, hey, I just invented Reese's peanut butter cups. You know, jalapeno chocolate, hey, I just invented Mayan chocolate. You know, so what happens is by painting the stripes in the parking lot, other people can play. They can come and park, they can build new things. And so understanding that if you do it right, you can build generative architectures that the crowd can then fill in, that the crowd can maybe augment or amplify. I think there is a lot to be said there. And so I just, studying the deep patterns there, I think, turn out to be really important if we're going to design our way out of some of the challenges we've talked about in the next few decades.
In our work, we have actually learned, especially now with the global recession, that it is very important to do more with less. And so that is the challenge. We are not at a time where innovators, architects and designers could create whatever they wanted at any cost just to woo and wow the public. So just again, like smartphones, we have realized we are responsible to use very little resources, but to create that kind of value and give our clients the most that is possible. So in that sense, I think our challenges have been tremendous because how do you do that, and how far can you go to be this innovator, this creative person that brings about new environments, new materials, new technologies, But we feel it's a responsibility to, in a way, consider that. As we have also been globally interconnected and interdependent, we're constantly also looking at the global changes that are taking place politically. If Europe goes down economically, it has tremendous impact on architecture and design in the United States. In fact, a lot of industries have gone out of business because there is not enough work to support them. And vice versa, as we come up with newer ideas, we create newer kind of industries. So we like to look forward for newer opportunities as other available industries perhaps are going out of business. With the new technologies now in architecture and in general in all designs, we are making smarter homes. Smarter homes require smarter engineering and mechanical systems. They need smarter audiovisual in work environments. We create new lighting. There is almost the old light bulbs are out of business because of now sustainability and how we have to create, we have to invent almost like a new LED bulb that lasts longer, it gives less heat, on and on and on. So as some industries are collapsing, we as creators and architects of the new world are creating new opportunities that in a way goes farther than our own studios and our own firms. And so it's a very exciting time, and we have in our office now come up with this kind of a holistic approach that whatever we do is not a local, just one firm's thinking, but we are globally, in fact, are impacting and connecting to other cultures and other societies. And so at the same time that there is a lot of turmoil and there is a lot going on around us today, but there is also a lot of excitement in terms of where we can go and what the opportunities are in the future for us.
That's great.
Interesting.
I was just going to add in that I guess it's a bit ironic for somebody that comes from a university where we charge mortgage rates basically to students to learn. But this idea of capital is actually part of the crisis of academia right now. In that, I like the saying, you can't crowdsource the iPhone, but MIT led the way in a way in sort of putting out all of their academic information, lectures, and so on. So you can go and actually watch the MIT professors remotely. You don't have to go to MIT and pay the same that you pay at Columbia and other Ivy League schools for that. So, but at the same time, the question is in academia, what is the value of the classroom experience, the experience with the professor, and so on. This is changing now because a lot of old, stodgy kind of curriculums are having to reinvent themselves. Luckily, as architects, we're always, super hip and new, right? So, we don't have to reinvent ourselves, but we rethink how we deal with this in a way. And I think it goes back to the idea that the government should, maybe, of course not at Columbia, but in general, support even architectural research, all of the information about smart homes and so on. There's very little that the government does. I can tell you, looking for grants to provide for research in these areas for architects. We're too much not a science and not an art, right? It's in the middle. So it's an interesting time right now, I think, with this focus on innovation and technology.
Philip, can I jump in there? I was thinking a little bit about something Mickey said, that crowds were conservative. It strikes me that also institutions are conservative, and to some extent governments are conservative, and I wonder to what extent the very idea of a government or an institution is incompatible with an idea of innovation. Now, I'm not saying there aren't examples of institutions that have fostered innovation, but I wonder to what extent the very idea of an inherently conservative institution is slightly with the obvious exception of Columbia.
Yes.
I'm also in favour of government supporting innovation in architecture, but I wonder to what extent this is actually realistic, to think that institutions like Columbia, institutions like the federal government in the United States can be at the forefront of fostering innovation.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't say that. I mean, just to reply, quickly to that, I wouldn't say that the building industry is all that innovative either. Typically, I mean, some are, but not all the time. So I think in general, it's not. The government may have its slowness, and institutions definitely. I can tell you, paperwork-wise, I have problems, things like that. So there's definitely a lot of inertia in something like that. But at the end of the day, I think the risk is what ends up turning industry into the slow mover.
But I mean, I think the governments, institutions, and I feel I'm probably naive if I stumble into policy talk here because I'm just a designer, but. There was no industry, there was no actual company that it was in their best interest to go to the moon and spend that much money. There was no industry or individual corporation that was in their best interest to build something called the internet. So in some ways, the invention or the innovation that came out of something like the Department of Mad Science in the government, right? They're called DARPA, but right, they built the ARPANET. And they were created the day after Sputnik flew overhead in the 50s. Where the president said that was a surprise because everyone could hear it on the radio. They could tune in and listen to it go overhead. And we should create an organization whose job is to make sure we don't get surprised again. And so that was how they were created. They built the first space agency and spun that out to something called NASA and things like that. So I think government can do it. And in fact, if we look today at the chief technology officer of the government, Todd Park, he is wildly creative, came from industry. And he said, wow, look at that. Reagan unlocked this thing called GPS. And industry took it and ran away with it. We have Garmin, we have cell phones that can actually tell us where we are. We've got geolocal services. NOAA was unlocked by the government, publicly funded National Oceanographic and Aerospace Organization. And suddenly we get Weather Channel, and we get weather.com, and we get weather apps on our thing. So there's a place for it. I don't know that it's necessarily at the center, but there is a place for it that's happening. He decided to unlock 400 data sets that go back to 1900 of health data. And he said, let's hold codathons on the weekend, and people can come up with cool apps to use these data sets. And in the course of less than a year, they have launched little startups that have turned into $500 million acquisitions. And I don't know, hundreds of thousands or not millions of new things are coming out of that. But it's finding the right place for those kinds of organizations. The bureaucracy is not necessarily bad. The opposite of bureaucracy is stigmergy, right? It's ants wandering around to find food and bubbling up patterns out of the noise. Neither one of them is necessarily bad in themselves. It's knowing how to move across that spectrum. Bureaucracy is putting up guardrails so people don't drive off a cliff, but sometimes you want people to wander over the guardrail and find a new path. And so it's understanding how we as an organization, we as people, we as a culture can find the right place for those components, because they do represent an important part.
If I can just add one thing about this sort of institutional versus individual kind of motivation. A lot of the things that you described were made from fear, and I do think some of our most innovative, amazing things, like think of Venice, for instance. Who would have put a town like that there except out of fear? Have been motivated by fear, Sputnik flying over, etc. But also things aren't always motivated that way, and I would say we had such an amazing experience with Lincoln Center and the board of Lincoln Center, and if anybody has been over there, you know that they actually let us invent things in the public realm that have never been done, and you would think that if any cultural organization in this country would be stymied to conservative response to things, it would be Lincoln Center, but in fact, it was exactly the opposite. And they were so, interested in having us show them what could be done. And I'm going to just say part of that was a board response, but also part of it was the strong individual at the top of the board, and that made a huge, huge difference. So I don't think we can just write off institutions as not allowing for innovation or creativity, but I do think there's a particular kind of construct in an organization that would allow it to happen.
If you look at the governmental analog to that here in New York, the Bloomberg administration has a lot of agencies who've been doing some really great work, and I think that the Department of Transportation in particular, 15 years ago, it was not a very lively, not a lively agency, but you have the model that Charles is talking about of somebody strong at the top who is open to ideas and influences from all over the place and willing to push something through. And the notion that Times Square could be partially pedestrianized, 10 years ago, people would have laughed you out of the room. That yet is an idea that came from a lot of sort of civic organizations, business organizations. The Times Square bid, I think, really put a lot of thought and energy into that over the years, very quietly, but then it took Jeanette Sadik-Khan to come in and say, you know what, boom, we're doing this. And that's such a wonderful example. But about the sort of government institution and innovation, you know, what that sort of triangle or relationship is, that also in the DOT, it's, I think under Sadik Khan, it has been so open to people who had been activists and who had, you know, there's one guy who's doing a lot of these pedestrianization projects, Andy Wiley Schwartz, who said, you know, a while ago, I was throwing rocks at the windows of the DOT, and now I'm inside, so it is literally the inmates running the asylum. And that's a wonderful thing for a city agency sometimes. So I think with the permeability, you can get some really interesting stuff back and forth.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I also agree. I don't think you can single out whether larger institutions or individuals. It's my theory is, and I've always been proven right, when you have a good idea, whether it will eventually be seen and it will eventually come to fruition. The point is to do the legwork and to put the time and have the passion to create, you know, as Steve Jobs said, again, you create and then people want it. The public doesn't know, and the institutions certainly wouldn't know what is acceptable or what is there to want. But I think, again, we as creative community need to show them what could be done. And trust me, if it's a good idea, it will get done. That is my experience.
The comment about, you know, a strong leader at the top, someone who gave you the right or the chance to change and redirect things. Buckminster Fuller, architect, engineer, et cetera, from the 20th century, he said, I want to be a trim tab. And I thought it was a really fascinating thing, and I think design and architects, we often want to be trim tabs. And the point is that if you look at the Queen Mary or something, a giant ocean-going vessel, it has a rudder. And on that rudder is the rudder's rudder. It's called a trim tab. And you bend that rudder's rudder a little bit, and it pulls the rudder, and it moves the entire thing. And I think finding those leaders who can help you be a trim tab, because they have the muscle to make a big difference, right? So a large organization, a big city, a country, whatever, can move in a new direction, but it needs trim tabs. And I think we as designers, architects need to be a trim tab. I think the other thing he said is I'm not a noun, I am a verb. And I always thought that was a nice thing too, because it was about the intersection of things together and making stuff happen versus talking just about things. It's the process or the unveiling of it. I think we have to be a verb in this space if we're going to change things.
Anybody want to respond to that?
I want to talk about money some more.
It's always good to talk about money.
No, please, jump in.
No, I just want to, you know, I hate to just pull this into like who's making more money, designers or architects, but I think there's really, you know, there's a lesson here, and I don't exactly know what it is, so I'm going to ask the designers sitting here to speak to this a bit. But I feel like architects are still operating in the service industry, and we lament this every day. You know, we're sitting here innovating for whom and for what. You know, because we love it. We love to do it, and that's why we do it. But we don't get paid for these things in residuals. And I was thinking about the metaphor you were using of the framework, and then the people who go into the framework and do the things. Well, those are the ones making the apps, and they're the ones getting a penny for each sale. And we've made this framework, which had to exist there, and we got paid a one-time deal. And what can we learn from that?
Well, I think, I would agree with you. You guys are in a service industry, and I think one of the things we've done is we are a laboratory. We have lab books. We take notes every day. We file for patents. We We have to defend patents. One of our founders went and helped Steve Jobs defend a patent in Texas last year because we had the patent on it before Steve Jobs did on something called cover flow and something called time machine from our research in 1989. And so we define those things and we capture those things and then we license those things and we look for places to do that. And yeah, a lot of the guys making apps are making money. Apple's making 30% off of every one of those apps because they built the architecture. So where is the opportunity for that? And I think there are a lot of opportunities to say ideas are power. I don't think we want to be completely protective of that power. Thomas Jefferson, the first head of the patent office, said that patents should be imperfect protection, not perfect protection. Right? He said it should be imperfect. There was a limit on the time that you could, as an innovator, have that thing because he wanted it to go into the idea commons, and he wanted everyone to be able to build on that. But we did want to have some method of reinforcing and rewarding people who come up with ideas. I think you guys have come up with things that could have been hundreds or billion-dollar companies left and right. I've looked at your stuff. It's amazing. But
Can we talk later?
But I think, we spun out an educational institute. It is the highest margin organization we have in a space where educational institutes are scrambling. And I don't know, in 2 years we've taught 4,000 people, and it came out of nowhere. And we started by really understanding and defining some things and then licensing it.
I mean, Charles, you began by saying that you saw part of your role as making problems for clients. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that. It seemed like an interesting statement, but I wasn't entirely sure what that meant as a process. But that seems very different to designing an app, or at least in my mind.
Well, I think, no, it's not. I mean, if you think about the problem, I mean, as designers, we're always trying to solve problems. And some of the problems can be obvious, that square wheel doesn't roll very well. Oh, what's the problem? Well, it doesn't roll. Let's make it round. So, but then if those problems aren't so obvious, you end up you devise them, and that becomes part of your research project, I suppose. So a lot of what we do is not just getting back to the money. You can't sell it, but it has to do with, let's say, issues of vision and visuality in our culture and sort of understanding what that means, and it's a non-essential problem. We make a problem that nobody's thought was there, and that actually becomes the thesis of the project a lot of times. So it's essentially about making something nonsensical make sense, or something, something like that. And that's what we try to do. I do wish that they were patentable, though, because I'd like to start making some money on them.
Because it just seems to me that like app design is more about tapping a need or tapping a market. There's an existing audience for something that somebody sees, and they kind of fill that hole.
Yes.
Whereas an architectural process seems very, very different. Almost like you're working for an existing client, you know what it is, you know what they want. So I just wondered, at least in my mind now, I'm just trying to think that almost like you're approaching it from a different...
Yeah, we solve the problems that the client brings to us by rote. We have to make sure a building works, but we always layer on other problems on top of that are our problems. What does it mean about education? We're doing 2 projects for Columbia, and we're in the middle of investigating what it means to teach in the building and how does a building respond to teaching. And that's not, the client didn't say, oh, go think about that so much. They said, give me 5 classrooms. And we said, well, what is a classroom? So we're trying to kind of evolve the problems out of things that come from the client, perhaps, or just the bigger problem, which is we got to make a building for education, stuff like that.
Well, this is great because that part of it would in the university be called research. I mean, that's what we do. Running a research lab out of a design school. That's what we basically do is make our own problems, right? Exactly. So nobody comes and says, can you guys play with carbon fiber and figure out like how to do panel systems with that? We just say we want to play with carbon fiber and we want to make panel systems. Then luckily, Columbia University has lawyers to do patenting and things like that. So that's what you need. That was a whole system like that. But we make our own problems too. So I think it's true even in academics.
I mean, I'm understanding design. Architecture or innovation there is a kind of change. Is that right? That might necessarily be the same thing in a design environment.
I can answer. I think it's the same way. The old-fashioned way of thinking about architecture, and in fact teaching architecture, was we are teaching you how to solve a problem. So architects always waited for the problem to come to them, and then for them to think about it and solve it in, few ways, 5, 10 different ways, and so on and so forth. The new way of thinking about architecture is where do we see where the problems are? In fact, we do create the problems, as it was said, because we are not in the business of creating solutions. We are in the business of creating and innovating new material, new products, new environments, new technologies. And therefore, we need to find out where something is needed, where we can have or bring perhaps a new product or a new material in with the spaces that we are designing, within the environments we are designing, and therefore creating the problems for ourselves, and then solving them in a very creative and innovative ways. So I think the new way, and in fact that's what I think most schools, and I think at Columbia as well, because I was teaching at Columbia for a while, from the first day we told the students, we give you something to think about, but it's not a problem. You have to go and create the problem to then resolve and to design. And this is, so they're thinking in a way opposite of how it used to be taught. If we go, I think, in the old way of thinking about architecture is what we get in most of the cities and the worlds that we live in. Very banal, very non-functional, very uninspiring buildings and nothing else. And we all feel, as I think creative people, that we can again bring so much more value to our everyday living and environments that we work in.
I think the future for architecture, for design, for the discipline, for the space, which is structured creativity to really help solve these problems and maybe pose these problems, I think it is, we have a bubble coming. I think there is a massive, massive bubble, just like the dot-com bubble, refreshed and fertilized the ground of the mountain that we're on, for the computing space. I think we have a massive bubble coming, and it's the bubble that has to do with when buildings and products and everything else actually start to join the social network. When atoms start to play with bits. And we're not talking small, we're talking trillions of things, whether they're devices, whether they're people, whether they're building blocks, all sometimes are always being connected. And we have this metaphor, nature's actually already done it. We have trillions of cells in our own body. We go for a good 80 years without rebooting or having a catastrophic failure. And I think the future for architecture, for buildings, for organisms, for communities is going to be about the social life of spaces. People talk about the Internet of Things, but it's wrong. I mean, we as a product design, we faced that a few years ago. There's no such thing as a disconnected product or service anymore. It's all connected. But the reality is it's not the Internet of Things. It's the Internet of Things and buildings and people and the world we live in. And since humans have evolved in physical built spaces or non-built spaces, but physical spaces for millions of years, we really use that to tame complexity. So, at the beginning of my conversation, I said I'm worried about malignant complexity. When you have a trillion smart little things all around you, you have the potential for horrible malignant complexity. And so, we're not talking a trillion $1 bills, by the way, right? We're talking about a trillion things, sending out 1 billion messages, turning into bricks because somebody didn't push an update. That could be really dangerous when it's the lights in an operating room. That could be incredibly horrible when it's an entire city got a bad patch from Microsoft, right? And so we're talking about a really rich, vibrant world. It's much more like ecologies. And the need for architects and the need for conscientious designers to pose those problems, to find those challenges, to not try to design the ecology, But to nudge and help and experiment and learn, I feel there's a renaissance coming, and I think it's a big deal.
I think I could listen to Mickey speaking all day, actually.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Speaking about the social life of spaces, I might just bring it back to this space for the minute. And I'd also add that Mickey has a new book out too, which he's hopefully going to pull out of his bag and show you for those that would just like to know about it. But thank you for being so patient and listening so graciously to our speakers. But I'd love to open it up to the room now to allow anybody really to approach the panel with a question or a comment. Please.
My son had my credit card. He wasn't impoverished. They always know how to get something out of you. Yeah. I think that's a question for the architects.
Yeah, I mean that question is why I'm sitting here today. Why does the sort of larger and very complicated social ills that come with poverty start to attach to a building and a building form to the point where people knock down high-rise projects? I mean, it's a long and complicated answer to that, but I think that it does get to the incredible power that people attach to spaces and to buildings. And so I don't know the answer to it, but I think you'd need an economist and a sociologist and to chime in on that as well.
Please. Yeah.
Thank you very much to the panel. I was quite inspired by the conversation. And Mickey, I think you mentioned a point about structured creativity, which I kind of assume is where architecture, design kind of fall under. And that being the case, and living in the world we live in today, knowing that structural creativity creates innovation and then move us forward, how do you actually make that part of the fabric of society so we don't have to wait until we have one good leader who is going to lead to make things happen? Instead, we are looking at it as part of our day-to-day activity because structural creativity is needed for survival.
So I'll maybe start, but I'm not sure I know what I'm talking about. But I think 100 years ago we decided, reading, writing, arithmetic, let's make those basic literacies. Before that, if you wanted to do arithmetic, you hired somebody called a computer. It was a career. They tabulated numbers. But then we said, let's make it a basic literacy that started at the age of 5. We succeeded. We now can make anything. We can make it right. These guys have labs. You can print things, or you can't print things, but you can hammer things together. But you can kind of make anything from heart valves to, new kinds of synthetic organisms. What's the right thing to make? And I think the next 100 years, the next 1,000 years is probably going to be a little closer to, if you can make anything and make it right, the next challenge is what's the right thing to make. And frankly, I think that means literacy in architecture and literacy in design. And I don't think it is save it for the, the black turtleneck design class. I think it is actually saying a basic literacy. We will always have mathematicians. We will always have people who do the deep lifting. But I think having a sensibility and understanding, the way that you attack a problem, the way you think about things, the system level thinking that comes from art, I think that's huge. And I'd rather see it taught at the age of 5 than wait as we beat creativity out of children. Oh, you didn't draw a rabbit very well, you should be an engineer. And then we try to reintroduce it when you're an MBA and you're going to the D school or something like that. And it's a little late. It's
to pick up on what you were saying earlier and Charles talking about education, I am fervently hopeful that this idea that as everything, we start to understand everything as interconnected, everything from your iPhone to the ride you take on the subway as part of a larger interconnected system. I think that the general literacy level even if people don't understand the mechanics of it, people will start to understand, or I hope they will, the value of the architecture of that system, and start to see that what architects and designers and planners, et cetera, can bring to giving order to this vast and deeply complicated web of interconnected things. I think that the sort of general level of literacy and appreciation for all of these fields will, I hope, cross fingers, begin to rise.
I think it's also through very early on education. When I went to school, computers were the size of this room. And I don't know if you remember me, this shows how old I am, but nevertheless, we had to punch cards. And if you had made one mistake, the program would not run, and you had to go and figure out which hole was put in wrong. Nowadays, we don't teach our kids computers. From when they are born, somehow they know how to. In fact, I always have to ask them to help me inputting my smartphone. It's intuitive what they are learning because it's so early on. They're wired in the technology. So imagine if that kind of accessibility was with architecture and design, and the thinking would automatically. My feeling is, and I hope one day I will have a privilege of actually, at least sitting on a board to think about this, is to create schools of innovation. When I came to this country to study for my university education, I in fact looked to go to a school of innovation. There is no college that offers any program, in fact, that is called, you're gonna be innovator. It's always fragmented into these parts. You either do industrial design to create products, or do architecture to make larger structures, and so on and so forth. So imagine if we did have, in fact, universities that somehow had a curriculum, or kindergartens, upward, where the kids didn't think about innovation, but they are wired to innovate.
Isn't that almost a contradiction in terms, though? Because if you're codifying it so much to, if there's a set curriculum for innovators, you first you do this and then you do that, that starts to almost argue against, a good school, a good university should be creating innovators. I think that should be inherent and implicit in that, in any curriculum, except for maybe, ancient Greek or something like that. You don't need to innovate very much.
It's the problem of the avant-garde, right?
Yeah.
Once the avant-garde is accepted,
Exactly.
it is not an avant-garde anymore, and so what does innovation even mean?
Exactly.
Well, I think it's also
It's a
better,
way of thinking, though. It's too.
Yeah.
What I am implying is not to go to school and say there is no formula for innovation.
Yeah.
If it was, trust me, most universities, Columbia University, Harvard, MIT, would have it. There is no formula. And in fact, most of our innovators, Steve Jobs, the Facebook guy, are people who dropped out of formal education to continue their vision and what they wanted to do. So they're not formally, graduated of the universities that they started. So I'm not, suggesting that. What I'm suggesting is somehow we have to, from very early on, get the neurons going and wire our younger generation to almost, have that within them. And not worry about it.
I love what you just said, because I think it's not about, the rote, this is how innovation works. But it is, I think the closest corollary I can see is jazz. I think jazz, you learn the standards, you learn the grades, you get really good at them. And then you turn off this piece of the brain, and they've seen it in MRI studies, it's the same part that gets turned off when you're sleeping, and it's called the fact checker. And you are playing something over here, and you turn off that fact checker, and you leap. And you really shouldn't be able to make it to the other side, because these two things shouldn't go together. And then you turn it back on and you find it and you land, and it's improvisation. And I think that there is a way to structure that. They've actually seen jazz musicians have a more developed part of that brain. It is something that can be learned, but it's not learning the rote stuff. It's actually learning that it's almost the jazz of innovation. And I don't know what that means exactly, but I feel like that's what we need to be teaching people. Because we're entering a logarithmically complicated world. And if we're not agile, I think there's a danger. And agility is conferred by this kind of ability to improvise.
I guess the problematic word is teach, because we don't really teach anymore. We guide the students. I mean, they already know how to do a lot of this stuff. In fact, sometimes, you know, computational work better than the professors do, right? So we just, you know, it's better to act as a guide and follow along with them and help them understand what the implications are of what they do. It's similar to how you run a practice, you know, so.
Well, you always hear in jazz about practice.
Please.
I'm sure a lot of people
It's better without it.
I'm sure most people in design or other innovation industries would agree that this is a value that can be brought very early in education. But in the meantime, you know, we're all here having not benefited from that since the age of 5 or whatever. I was hoping any of the panelists could talk about ways of compellingly, I don't know if it's selling the service, but describing the value of that kind of innovation to, you know, Columbia, who asked for 5 classrooms. Because that's you have a client who wants X. Real innovation is probably X and Y. How do you get to that point of participating constructively on their needs and these other needs?
Yeah, I mean, we can't change the terms of the problem, of the bigger problem often, but we can try. I mean, we can speak about, you know, are they doing all they can within the confines of their program to help people, you know, learn, or whatever it is we want them to do, experience actually. But so we each need to do what we can where we're given the opportunities, and we need to be tactical as opposed to strategic about this. We need to actually understand where a little opportunity has landed and be able to throw something in there. You know, I mean, and you know, there is maybe a fallacy about how much we can do with teaching. It seems that we can only put something in front of someone. Someone still has to move into it, and there has to be an acceptance and understanding of it on that other person's side. You know, whether you're 5 years old or 50 years old. But we can offer, you know, some exposure, and I guess that's what we need to start thinking about. And we don't give that. It doesn't mean that if we put design in classrooms in kindergarten, everybody all of a sudden is going to be design guru. It's like saying that if you let homosexuals out in the world, everybody's going to turn gay. You know, like that old 50s argument. You know, you know, things will find a natural balance, but we should be presenting these things more readily, I think.
Please.
The whole involvement of the community now, as in government
I'm trying to, what's your question though? Is it how?
How do you get the emphasis back on the designer,
Oh.
particularly in government, and
So-
particularly in community?
So first I think my whole profession, industrial design or product design, the reason we called it post-industrial is because we kind of thought it was becoming a commodity, and it really did. What happens is design traditionally was you came with a problem, we threw you an answer. And I think what we're discovering is, and the best designers and the best architects have always known, that it's collaborative. You know, they're going to push you, you're going to push them. We're both broken, but we both together can do something we couldn't do ourselves. And it really is about taking on someone else's agenda, but exercising your demons. So I think collaborative innovation for people is really the challenge that we have moving forward. I'm not sure that I want the designer to be the god in this kind of thing. I just think that I think there's a value in knowing that some people have actually practiced that deeply and they know what they're doing there. And let's not be naive to think you'll get that out of the crowd. A good generative architecture sometimes, though, will surprise the designer. So while Steve Jobs might have created the iPhone, could he have really predicted the 3 billion different apps that are now there, and some of them have turned out to be amazing, that could really turn into the next Apple? Who knows? So I think it's more about fostering this really fertile space, and at least having an honest discussion that design is an important component of business. You know, that's why the D School at Stanford is here now. That's why Rotman is doing a business degree in design. You know, that's why all the major universities are looking at that, because people are realizing that design is important to business. It's hard. I think in government, yeah, the easy answer is, hey, let's just crowdsource it, and you'll get a lot of crap. So you've just created a larger pool of stuff that you have to wade through. But there have been amazing things like the X Prizes, you know, that are another form of crowdsourcing, but it's a specific architecture of crowdsourcing, where, you know, suddenly we've got Richard Branson going into outer space, you know, because of a prize and a very specific architecture about how X Prize style things have happened. And X Prize have been around for 100 years or more in terms of the architecture of it. So I think it'd be nice if we had a more informed conversation about that, and didn't just kind of look at the easy answer. It's very easy now. It's the church of what's now. Apply design, you'll be great. And I think there's something deeper there. I don't know if that answered.
Guys, I think we've
Yeah.
come
Can I add
please,
to
yes.
this? I also feel I've never had too much problem with communities and with boards, because they are there in a way to protect the institution, the city. I mean, I always have felt that they are there to make things better. They are not against good design. They are not against architects. I've been shocked at times when we have to go in front of community boards that no one has any education in any form of art or design. You know, an elderly housewife, someone from the neighborhood. I mean, but people have interest. They do come because their community, their neighborhood is important to them. And we as architects perhaps have a bad rep. You know, it has been this notion that architects make things more expensive. They're extravagant. They do crazy work that doesn't fit, so on and so forth. I think those are, again, to me, the old times. We have, nature of architecture is not one God that designs and everybody else just draws what comes to your mind. We are collaborators with many, many different people. We source things out. Technologies have become so complicated that not one even firm can handle larger projects. And so because of that, already we are very comfortable with discussing, with sharing, with collaborating, you know, with other entities and people. And so the communities and community boards are only one other groups that you need to explain. So communication, in my judgment, is the way. When people understand what is at stake and what you want to do, you often find them helping out and, in fact, backing you up. So, again, could be just a personal thing, but I don't feel as threatened being one against many anymore.
Just to pick up on that and to your question, you know, the public in general, they're not good designers. And so you can't, I think it's really important how one frames the question. When you're doing a crowdsourcing project, you know, junk in, junk out. And so you really have to frame the question. So it's not, you want to, how do you make your street better? Well, I want 4 more stop signs on it. That's the wrong answer. You want to design the question so that it's, I want it to be safer to walk across the street. And so you're trying to, I guess, ask for the performance that people want as opposed to the specific object result that they want, because everybody wants a mansion in the sky, and that's, you're not going to get that. You have to be smart about your question.
I would also hate if we really insisted that people had to be designers or care about architecture. I'd like them to live their lives. And I think that the comment about maybe education and things like that, that's because I think there just needs to be a hell of a lot more designers and architects in the world, because we're going to have a real challenge in a world where it's unbounded what you can make. We have to start doing that. But I don't think we should be asking everybody to be really sophisticated about that. I think they should be able to live their lives. Margaret Mead said what people say they do and what they actually do are usually 2 very different things. And so I think, to your point about asking the right questions, that's the architect's job, the designer's job, to help frame the conversation, to actually draw out maybe unvoiced needs, unmet needs, exactly. and then be able to apply their expertise to do something with it.
I'm afraid we've run a little over time, so I'm not in a position to take any more questions, but if you could please put your hands together and thank our panelists for their time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.